to thank our sponsors, Good Deal Insurance, Dean and Hamilton Realtors, and A Taste for Wine and Spirits. We hope that you'll stay after the talk, have some wine and cheese, or wine and cheese, and books will be for sale, thanks to Buttonwood Books. Imperium's plot is an unusual one. In 1902, a radical vegetarian and nudist from Nuremberg named August Engelhardt set sail for what was then called the Bismarck Archipelago. His destination was the island of Capricorn, and his goal was to establish a colony based on worship of the sun and coconuts. Following a series of wildly unorthodox adventures, his malnourished body was found on the beach in Capricorn in 1919. He was 43 years old, an icon of failed idealism and extremism. Imperium, a fiction of the South Seas by German author Christian Krach, has proven to be an international sensation and been awarded many prestigious literary awards. Those of us who only read English can thank Daniel Bowles, our guest today, a Boston College German Studies professor, for translating Imperium into English in 2015. Michael Upchurch of the Seattle Times said of Bowles, "It's a credit to Daniel Bowles that as you make your way through the novel's perverse extravagances, you always feel you're reading an original maverick stylist, never a translation." Please join me in welcoming Daniel Bowles.
Thank you all for coming, especially on this rather bleak Sunday afternoon. I'm glad we didn't have snow, or else I'd be talking to an empty room, I'm sure. I'm very pleased to see you all here. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you to the Cohasset Library for hosting me. I'm also pleased to see so many of you here to hear about a novel that is a translation, and a novel, as a German studies professor, of a Swiss writer in German. This is not a common occurrence that we are able to talk about such things. I'll give you a brief overview of what I'll go through today. I want to introduce myself a bit and introduce the author and his place in contemporary literature. He's a living, breathing writer right now. In fact, his newest novel just came out last fall. But I'll talk to you a bit more about Imperium itself, as well as working on it, practically speaking, the translation, the kinds of difficulties one might encounter, and the interesting literary aspects of it. As Jackie said, I'm a professor at Boston College, and I translate in my, I wouldn't say spare time, but I translate as a primary means of outreach to my students and to other students who don't take German. I'm assuming many of you have not learned German. It's usually very few. My special area is contemporary literature, 20th century literature, and Christian Krach is one of my very favorites, and he has been for some time. So it's delightful for me to be able to engage with him and to work with his novel. I mentioned that I'm so glad to see so many of you here because this is a translation. You may be aware of the oft-cited statistic that of the books read in the United States, only 3% of them, though tendency rising, are translations. In the rest of the world, the average is around 25%. This means it's very difficult for authors in foreign languages to be translated into English. The market is too tight. But if they can make it into English, they have a ready readership here to read them. I first learned about Christian Krach when I was still, well, I was a year abroad when I was a Fulbright student in Berlin. And I read a novel, not this one, called 1979 as part of a seminar on madness in literature. And this was a sparkling little novel about a young man. It was a first-person perspective novel. A young man on the eve of the Iranian Revolution, living a hedonist life, and it turns into this kind of ascetic journey into Tibet. I won't ruin it for you, it hasn't yet been translated. One day we'll perhaps work on that. But it came out right around September 11th of 2001. So this was one of his first big splashes on the literary scene, where he seemed to be capturing a kind of zeitgeist at the time. The sort of confrontation between East and West that was about to rear its ugly head. It is a joy of mine, particularly to translate contemporary authors. I have not yet translated the bygone authors of the German tradition, because I get to work with them. And as a teacher of German literature and of German language, it's a real treat to be able to sit down with the author and ask him or her the questions that I would be asking my students. Interpretive questions, for example, or in the case of Kracht, if they speak the target language, his English is better than mine, I must say. Ask him stylistic questions. Why did he write in this way? So this was a real treat for me, and I hope you can sense in reading the novel some of the joy that I felt in translating it. But who is this strange figure? Kracht, he is Swiss. He was born in 1966 in Zahn in Switzerland, a small mountain village. His father, and this is sort of relevant to his current reception. His father, also named Christian Kracht, was a prominent publisher in Germany, a publishing executive, to be more specific, with the Axel Springer concern. This was a publishing house that was heavily involved in the student revolutions in Europe in 1968. Very controversial, large publishing house, and it made his father a very wealthy man. He also then retired to Switzerland. So Kracht grew up and is often considered by German critics to be a kind of spoiled rich kid. At least that's the way he was when his first novel came out when he was around 29. So this is the kind of the cloud sort of hanging over his head as he's beginning his literary career. But he was educated largely abroad, in Germany and in Canada, and he went to college here in the United States, at Sarah Lawrence College, in fact, where he studied film studies. This becomes important for both this novel, Imperium, and his newest one, called The Dead. He then got a job working for prominent German newspapers and magazines like Spiegel and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, traveled around to India and Bangkok, doing sort of travel reporting and writing small vignettes that were published in these venues. But as I say, he had a kind of reputation for living abroad like this as a spoiled rich kid. It wasn't until his first novel came out, Faserland, which is supposed to be a terrible German pronunciation of fatherland, Faserland, in 1995 that he really emerged onto the literary scene specifically. And this novel was also another, it is now read in German school, the German school system actually, capturing the youthful pop spirit of the mid-90s. In fact, Kracht is associated, or was then, often with pop literature, by which I mean literature that engages with the younger generations in the post-wall era of Germany. This is important because much of post-war German literary history is about working through the Holocaust, working through the atrocities of the Second World War, coming to terms with this through literature. Just as American authors have been trying to write the great American novel, German authors were trying to write the great German novel, something to bridge the divide between East and West. Pop literature turned its back on that kind of historical burden and wanted to engage with the present. And his first novel certainly did this. Since Faserland, he's written now 4 novels. One of them, Ich werde hier sein im Sonnenschein und im Schatten, which is I will be here in sunshine and in shadow. This is a line from the song O Danny Boy. And it is a kind of dystopian fiction about the future. If Vladimir Lenin had not gone to Moscow to start the revolution in 1917, but had stayed in Switzerland, in Bern, as he had, and started the communist revolution there, what would have become of Europe? This is the sort of speculative question of that particular piece. And then, of course, Imperium comes onto the scene in 2012. His most recent one, The Dead, I'll talk about in a moment. But Imperium sparked a controversy in Germany that luckily it did not spark here. In the day that the book appeared, this, by the way, was the original edition with a kind of, what is it, this cartoon style of the Tintin comics you might have seen. In fact, because there is a cartoon or a comic book character who shows up in the novel. The day after the novel was released, the journalist Georg Dietz of the Spiegel, Germany's equivalent of The Economist, more or less, wrote a scathing review of it without having read the novel, claiming that that Kracht's sort of flippant self-performance with the media and his engagement with some rather questionable figures in the literary world made him the quote, gatekeeper to right-wing thought. There was the sort of Nazi undertone here. Nothing, I can assure you, could be further from the truth. But his diagnosis rested on the fact that he was setting the narrator's voice in Imperium equal to that of Kracht himself. That Kracht himself was speaking through the narrator. And for those of you who have read this novel, or read even parts of it, you will know that in the words of Christian Kracht himself, the narrator is a jackass, as he puts it. He is not, he is an arch humoristic but wry figure who inserts himself, is as much a character in a sense as the protagonist, August Engelhardt. This bad review sparked a protest among other literary figures, including the Nobel Prize winner Elfriede Jelinek, who came to his defense in the newspapers. But one thing it did do is get people to read the book. And it turns out they liked it quite a bit. He is, Christian Kracht, the most prominent living Swiss author right now, without a doubt. And perhaps one of the most prominent authors writing in German. So all Germany, Austria, Switzerland together. His work in general can be divisive, not only for its content, but though he's widely read and generally very popular, but also for its tone. As I mentioned, he was considered a kind of progenitor of the pop literature generation, a sort of circle of young authors in the mid-90s. He doesn't like that term particularly, and to be fair, it doesn't quite fit him any longer. This would most certainly not be considered a novel of pop literature. But his novels do typically have a certain number of characteristics in common. They tend to involve a journey, a protagonist's journey from one place to another. In the case of his first novel, it's sort of a journey from the northern vacation island of Sylt in northern Germany to Zurich, Switzerland. In the case of 1979, it's the protagonist's journey from Tehran to the holy Mount Kailash in Tibet, and then to a Chinese labor camp. In Imperium, of course, we have August Engelhardt leaving Europe for the German colony of German New Guinea in the South Seas. The journey never goes well, typically speaking. The protagonist usually his journey ends in failure, often death. There's also often a grand idea or project that the protagonist would like to realize. And this way you might compare him to the Austrian author Thomas Bernhard, who has also been translated quite a bit into English. I can recommend his novel, The Loser, if you happen to get your hands on it. It's quite humorous and good. His novels tend to involve a very florid Baroque style. Kracht is, in many ways, he himself finds his roots in Germany and Switzerland problematic, but he will always say, no matter where he lives, he always maintains this love of the language. And so you can tell that he delights in the particularities and the idiosyncrasies of German. And so he's very playful in that sense in his writing. His tone is often one of irony. And there is quite a bit of intertextuality in his novels, meaning he's borrowing allusions from other authors, he's making allusions to other works of literature, to other works of philosophy and the like. Imperium is no different. It's a kind of pastiche of much of Kraft's literary heritage. He also has a kind of fascination with disgust. There's the famous line of Napoleon's, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step," and Kraft navigates that difference quite frequently, going from the sort of sublimity of Engelhardt's idealistic project to the nitty-gritty of the horrible leprous sores that develop on his legs as a result of his malnutrition. This is a common theme of his work. For Imperium, he won a number of prizes in Germany, including the Wilhelm Raabe Prize, and most recently for his newest novel, the Swiss Book Prize, the National Book Prize of Switzerland. Now, Jackie's given you a short, sort of tantalizing bit about the plot of Imperium, and I'd like to talk a bit more about it, hopefully not spoil it for anyone. It is his first work of historical fiction, so it is based on a real-life character. August Engelhardt did exist. He died in 1919, though in the book he dies much later. So Kraft is very liberal with his use of and reading of history. It is also the first time he uses a third-person narrator. This is important because we're no longer looking at the action of the novel through the person of the narrator, but from without. And this distances us in a certain way from what's going on in the novel. It also gives him a chance to let his language come alive through the narrator's voice. This figure, August Engelhardt, was in fact disgusted with the increasingly modern alienation from modern life taking place around 1900. Germany was industrialized, it was modernizing rapidly, it was urbanizing rapidly, and this gentleman simply could not keep pace with this fast pace of modern life and decided to beat a hasty retreat into the hinterlands of Germany's small colonial holdings at the time. Kraft refers to this in the novel as retreating into, quote, a barbarism most exquisite. So he disembarks then around 1900, 1902 for the German Protectorate, German New Guinea, to found the Order of the Sun, which is supposed to be a utopian colony of nude sun-worshipping cocovores who could resist the advance of modernity. Now this was, as you might imagine, a kind of harebrained scheme, even by the standards of the strangeness going on around the early parts of the 20th century, and certainly in Germany at the time. He was considered an outsider. He was a very strange-looking fellow himself. His hopes and plans in the novel to realize this colony are dashed repeatedly against the rocks of modern reality. The swindling of his fellow men around him, the characters, for example, of Govinda Rajan and Queen Emma, also a real character, a kind of land baroness in the German Protectorate. He had numerous disputes with other fellow disenchanted outsiders, like Heinrich Eukens and Max Lützow, two gentlemen who come to live on his colony, live on his island, as well as the inventor of Vegemite, Edward Halsey, and others. Along the way, along Engelhardt's journey, he encounters a number of unnamed literary figures from German history. They always go unnamed, well, except for two. But he runs into Hermann Hesse in Florence. One of the characters meets a young Franz Kafka on vacation in Norderney, in the North Sea. He meets Thomas Mann in an ill-fated encounter on the beach in Lithuania. Edward Halsey and he have a dispute in Australia, and he is visited by the painters, modernist painters Emil Nolde and Max Pechstein on his island. And he also encounters the Italian comic book figure, Captain Christian Slutter from the Corto Maltese comics. Now, while I guess you could say that with all of the failures of these protagonists, you might quote Robert Burns that the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, and here that is certainly the case. But there's a further complication in Kracht's novel that makes it particularly interesting. There's a chilling comparison that takes place on page 8 and 9 of the book. The narrator is telling us that he's going to give us the story of Engelhart as a kind of exemplar. And he says, thus as a stand-in, the tale of but a single German will now be told, of a romantic who was, as are so many of this species, a thwarted artist. And if at times, in the course of things, parallels arise with a later German romantic and vegetarian who perhaps ought to have remained at his easel, then this is entirely intentional, naturally due pardon, consistent in Nuce. At the moment, the latter is still just a pimply, cranky lad who gets innumerable smacks from his father. Just wait and see, though, he grows and grows. The German romantic vegetarian at his easel he's referring to is naturally Adolf Hitler at the time. Engelhart is supposed to stand in for the sort of inanity of his idealistic utopian vision, is supposed to stand in for the inanity of all of these kinds of idealistic utopian visions, that they are always already, as he says in Muche, with his pun on the coconut, destined to fail, destined to be disastrous for all those around him. The imperium of the title can be understood in at least 4 different ways. We have the imperium from which he flees, the Kaiser's imperium, his colonial empire. We have the imperium of the Third Reich, which is casting a shadow over the novel from the beginning. We also have Engelhart's harebrained utopia as a kind of imperium of its own, and at the very end of the novel, the Americans show up on the scene in the Pacific stage of World War II, and their imperium displaces all of the others. There's a kind of cyclical nature to history that Kracht is talking about throughout this novel. It's a really remarkable read for a number of reasons. I'd like to tell you a bit about what makes this novel special as opposed to any other run-of-the-mill German novel from the last 5 years. First and foremost is the narrator. It's the first thing you'll notice. The narrator, this arch third-person narrator who is omniscient but sly, is really quite a character. The first time I read the novel, I kept thinking of George Saunders' narration of All About Eve. This really overarching voice who is completely unreliable. The narrator lies to us, he misleads us throughout, he withholds evidence from us about truths, who killed whom. He routinely inserts factual errors into the novel. He maintains a strongly subjective perspective on the action and reflects on the text itself, that this is in fact a book, that he's writing this book, and on his qualities as a writer. There's one point, at one point he even mentions, he gives a metaphor for something occurring and says that this is a metaphor of a second-rate writer. It's also Kracht sort of playing with his own self-deprecation. There's a mixture of time levels going on here too. When does this book take place? Well, certainly Engelhart is in the South Seas around 1900. But the narrator knows what is going to happen, and so he clearly knows that World War II is going to occur and end, and he's talking about the period after the post-war era. So it seems to be told in perhaps the 1960s or 70s, but it's uncertain. And this jumping around from time to time, flashbacks to Engelhart's experiences in the northern Prussian areas in, say, Lithuania at the time, to his visit to Halsey in Australia, are juxtaposed with these jumps forward. It's a very episodic narrative. The historical allegory is really quite important for our understanding of the novel, too. Engelhart is a cautionary figure. He seems harmless. And in fact, there is the motto of the novel, the Mark Twain quote that, what is this, that naked people have little or no influence on society at the beginning. It's a sort of tongue-in-cheek reference, of course, to the fact that Engelhart's his school of idealism has very much had an effect on society. And the novel has a kind of circular form to it. You may have noticed if you've read the novel from beginning to end, it ends just as it began, with the same paragraph, in fact. The novel foregrounds symbols, circular symbols, symbols of the snake that eats its own tail, the Ouroboros, excuse me. Other sort of circles show up throughout. This is about the cyclical nature of history, the unavoidable, inescapable nature of fate, in a sense. Now, onto the translation. Working on this novel with Christian was really quite a delight. First and foremost, because the job came through by word of mouth. I had done some prior translations for a novelist on whom I wrote my dissertation, Thomas Meinecke. And I remember one morning in the fall of 2012 receiving an email, and it had as the sender Christian Kracht, and as the subject Thomas Meinecke. I thought it must be the other way around. Why would I be getting a message from this author I never met, but whom I like very much? And he said that he was in need of a translator, and he had spoken with Thomas Meinecke, and my name came up. Of course, if I was a fanboy, if I had that sort of that sort of habitus, then it certainly came out. I jumped at the opportunity, and so I translated a sample. He seemed to like the sample, so we went on with this work in the fall of 2012 and the beginning of 2013. What really caused me to, this became a very special project to me, because in the spring of 2013, Kracht came to Boston for a week to work with me on the translation. It happened to be the week of the Boston Marathon that he came. So the day before the marathon he arrives, I meet him for the very first time, and the next day is, of course, chaos. So we spent the week holed up in his hotel room, reading the translation aloud to one another to sort of polish different parts, unable to leave because the Cambridge police had closed off the Harvard Square area. I did have to find a very clever way of violating the travel ban to get him back to the airport on Friday to get him to Switzerland. They said no drivers in Cambridge, but they didn't say Somerville, and I live on the Somerville-Cambridge line, so I thought it was clever. So we worked intensively on the translation that week, going back and forth. As I mentioned, his English is fluent, accentless, more or less. There's a slight kind of almost British tone to it because his father had studied in Britain during his own youth. But it was quite interesting. We agreed on, 99.5% of the translation. There were just some things he wanted to sound differently. And this was fascinating to be able to hear how a novelist hears literature, how he hears language being beautiful, as opposed to how I, as a critic or as a teacher, hear language being used. It was a wonderful collaboration. It continued, and it will continue also to his next novel, preview of Coming Attraction. But the translation wasn't easy. Christian's prose is difficult to navigate. The narrator in Imperium uses a German that was common in travelogues around 1900. It's got a very specific tone to it that does not read like contemporary spoken German at all. There are archaic formulations everywhere. Because of the presence of Captain Christian Slutter, there is nautical terminology everywhere, which is really quite difficult from someone who comes from Kentucky. One example for besäbelt, he uses this word besäbelt, which I agonized over. I thought I had an intuitive sense of what this means, but I thought I'll check the standard dictionary of the German language, the big one, which was compiled by Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm in the 19th century. Etymologically very complex. And I find this word. And it means drunk, or sort of tipsy. I thought, oh, that makes sense. There's a police officer who is described as besäbelt, and he didn't want to fill out some paperwork because he didn't want to delay his evening beer after he got off work. I thought, oh, that makes sense in context. No, it was simply a sort of neologism he invented that means sabered. Säbel, the word in that adjective, means saber. So these sorts of confusions were everywhere. There's a moment also where he quotes what seems like a poem, 2 lines of a poem in dactylic meter, and it doesn't come from anything. I thought I might try to figure out what this is, find an extant translation. And translating poetic meter from English or from German into English was also not easy. It reads in the English, "Yet drunken the singer, not heeding the warning, back into the maelstrom turns now his gaze." Those 2 lines took hours to put together. That was also quite difficult. But what is perhaps most difficult about the novel is the language itself. How many of you are familiar or have taken German classes ever in life? A handful. Okay. Well, German is a marked language. So those of you who have taken Latin before will be familiar perhaps with marked languages. It has a case system. Marked languages, the marked nature of German frees it from the strictures of syntax that English has in word order. Subject and object determines, in a sense, how we read a sentence and what does what to whom. German doesn't need that reliance on word order because the nouns themselves or the articles are changed to tell you what the function is, the grammatical function, in the sentence. So for example, you would have the sentence in English, "The man eats the lion." It is a kind of nonsensical sentence, but it is very clear what the subject of the sentence is, what the verb is, and where the object is. In German, you could say, "Den Mann frisst der Löwe," and you will know that the person or the thing doing the eating is the lion, not the man. It starts with the direct object, and that the difference between R and N, den Mann and der Löwe, tells you the function. So syntax German is syntactically much more complex in a sense than English. There was also a study done last year, the year before, I believe, to measure the weirdness of languages around the world. 239 languages were measured, and the way they determined weirdness was describing the linguistic characteristics of these languages and seeing which ones were the rarest and which language then had the greatest number of rare features shared by no other language. The most weird language was a Native American language spoken in Oaxaca in Mexico. German was 10th out of 239, and the only European language to make it that far up. English, by the way, is 33rd, and the least weird language is Hindi. It shares the most characteristics with most other languages. What do I mean by this? Well, because of the tone, because of the travelogue-like language from around 1900, Kracht uses frequently a device in German that my students dread it when I teach it to them, called extended adjective clauses. So for example, you could take a relative clause, a descriptor of a noun, the lion who ate the man, and you can, with a few alterations, take that clause and put it in front of the noun as a kind of long adjectival phrase. These are primarily used in formal writing, not much in speech, but they can make language more complex or make, shall I say, complex language flow more freely. They always sound funny in English. So for example, the route of the Sunday, March 19th, 2017 in South Boston under overcast skies in honor of the Irish St. Patrick held parade, which I did not attend, was shortened today.
Oh, wow.
That it would be, if I translated it back into German, a perfectly acceptable sentence. But those are the kinds of things that one has to negotiate. Where do you put all of this stuff once you have to force it into a stricture where subject, object, or subject, verb, object is what makes our language work? there were quite a few moments of head scratching here. And there were a number of strange cultural terms that simply wouldn't have translated well into English. At some point, Engelhardt, while with Edward Halsey in Australia, tries a kind of homeopathic beverage called Heilerde, which is still sold today. It is medicinal clay. It is quite literally dirt mixed into water and then drunk for its expurgative properties, I suppose. But who knows what medicinal clay is nowadays? And at some point he also uses English in the German original and says that a certain person was, as the British would say, pushing up daisies. Doesn't make sense for an American audience for me to keep that in English and say the British say pushing up daisies, we say it. So we finally found an idiom that was close in French, which literally means to eat the dandelions by the root. So we changed some things around there. And a couple of passages I'd like to read to you as well, just to give you a sense of what the book sounds like, and the kinds of references that Kracht is making throughout. I mentioned that Engelhardt has an encounter with the great German author Thomas Mann. Mann is, of course, unnamed. He's shown in the novel as the editor of a satirical magazine, Simplicissimus, walking with his beloved wife on the shores of Lithuania in East Prussia. Well, that would tip off a German reader typically, oh, that's Thomas Mann. And after this encounter, Mann sees Engelhardt nude on the beach, deftly directs his fiancée's eyes away from the offender, and then reports him to the police. He is then arrested brutally, and that is more or less the triggering moment that makes Engelhardt decide to leave Germany forever. But in describing this moment, Kracht employs Thomas Mann's very complicated language. German sentences in Mann are artful constructions that can go on for pages. And this one, I will read you actually two sentences, but two sentences that then I had to translate into English as well. I'll read it to you in the German first, so you can just hear how it sounds, and then I'll read the English translation. Der Redakteur und seine Braut sind noch tagsüber Richtung München abgereist. Der Vorfall ist schon fast vergessen. Man sitzt sich im Speisewagen des angrenzenden Waggon I gegenüber. Die eisenbahnbedingten Flecken einer in leichtem Übermut bestellten ganzen Flasche Trollinger färben das Tischtuch violett. Die Konversation verläuft nicht eben fließend, sei es aus Müdigkeit oder gar aus bereits jetzt antizipierter, nach Jahren der Ehe einsetzender Langeweile. Der Blick, second sentence, des Redakteurs fällt leicht unenthusiasmiert nach links durch die sich verdunkelnde, von Minute zu Minute spiegelähnlicher werdende Zugscheibe hinaus auf die verblassende ostpreußische Ebene, und er wird plötzlich der fast knabenhaft schmalen Schultern des gestern am Strande liegenden nackten jungen Mannes gewahr, und er erkennt in diesem Augenblick den eigentlichen Grund, weswegen er Anzeige erstattet hat, und dass sein gesamtes zukünftiges Leben von einer schmerzhaften Selbstlüge überlagert sein muss, deren Gewaltigkeit alles verfärben wird bis zu seinem Todestag. Die noch ungeborenen Kinder, die Arbeit, denn in ihm reifen mehrere Romane, das jetzt noch amüsierte Verhältnis zum Ideal seiner eigenen Bürgerlichkeit und die nun schon einsetzende Abscheu vor den auf dem Speisewagentisch gefalteten, in eleganter Ruhe liegenden Händen seiner geduldig lächelnden Verlobten, die ihrerseits in jahrzehntelanger Ahnungslosigkeit verharren wird, obgleich natürlich in ihr eigener Hand, sich mit einer gewissen Unweiblichkeit zu geben und zu kleiden, der jungen Frau vielleicht jetzt schon am Anbeginn ihrer Beziehung einen Anhaltspunkt vis-à-vis den tatsächlichen Neigungen ihres Anversprochenen hätte geben können. There we go. Two sentences. Complex sentences, but sentences nonetheless. In the English. the editor and his bride, Thomas Mann and his future wife, Katja. The editor and his bride left for Munich by daybreak, the incident nearly forgotten already. They are sitting across from one another in the dining car of the adjoining Wagon-Lit. Railroad-induced stains from a bottle of Trollinger, ordered in a moment of airy mischief, have splotched the tablecloth with purple hue. Second sentence. The conversation isn't quite flowing, be it from fatigue or perhaps from an already anticipated sense of the boredom that will set in after years of marriage. With a mild lack of enthusiasm, the editor's gaze tracks left, out through the darkening pane of train glass, which grows more and more mirror-like by the minute, onto the fading East Prussian plain, and he suddenly becomes aware of the almost boyishly slender shoulders of the naked young man lying on the beach yesterday, Engelhardt, and he recognizes at this moment the actual reason he lodged a complaint, and that his whole future life will be, must be, covered over in painful self-deception, the immensity of which will discolor everything until his dying day, the still unborn children, the work, for several novels are ripening within him, the still amused relationship to the ideal of his own bourgeois sensibility, and the now nascent revulsion at those hands there, folded in elegant calm on the dining car table, of his patiently smiling fiancée, who in turn will persist in decades of ignorance through her propensity to behave and dress with a certain unwomanliness, though her propensity to behave and dress with a certain unwomanliness might have given the young girl, perhaps even now, at the outset of their relationship, an indication vis-à-vis the actual proclivities of her betrothed. It was fun to, but if the whole novel had been like that, it would have been a bear. So this is the kind of stylistic pastiche we encounter throughout. The whole novel doesn't read like this, but this passage about Thomas Mann invokes Thomas Mann and his style, his characteristic style. There was another passage that I found particularly difficult to translate, and I'm still not sure that I'm satisfied with it. This is a moment in which the narrator is telling us about our incapacity to envision what we cannot know. And every time I read this passage, I think back to the early 2000s and the Gulf War and Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns and unknown unknowns. And this is the sort of passage about the unknown unknowns. Humanity was not yet ready to accept Engelhardt's doctrine, however. Humankind must first begin to transcend itself. And he called upon, this is Engelhardt, he called upon the following analogy, during the narration of which Oykins, his head cocked slightly, scratched his forehead in thought. If, while hunting around, for instance, an ant fell upon a piece of chocolate it had detected through the indeed astoundingly complex design of its antennae sensorium, then this was an event comprehensible within the bounds of the Formosine conceptual horizon and wholly natural to it. But if a human being entered into the equation, wanting to safeguard his chocolate, for example, by preventing that insect from notifying its peers so that together they might take possession of the sweet comestible, and if he thus hid the chocolate from the insect inside an icebox, then the ant, whose groping movements would grow continually slower and more unsure on account of the cold, still wandering around on that chocolatey surface, would have no possible way to figure out what was happening. The fact that it and the object of its desire had been put into a cold, hostile environment would lie entirely outside its conceptual apparatus. Not even in 100,000 years could the ant understand the mechanism underlying the onset of its own demise by freezing. Lacking, as it does, the ganglionic armamentarium, for example, to understand why it had ever become necessary for a culture to design a cabinet in which things may be kept cold by adding blocks of ice. That was also more or less one sentence in the original, but it was conceptually quite difficult to convey the clarity of thought that I found in the German. I have another example I could read to you, but I think I've probably spoken for long enough. I did want to say a quick word, though, about his next novel, which also is historical fiction. It is called The Dead. Die Toten in German. This novel, it's really quite wonderful, takes place in the Weimar era, right around 1932, 1933. Its protagonist is a fictional Swiss film director, clearly modeled after Kracht himself, Emil Nägeli, who is contracted by the great film magnate Alfred Hugenberg and Nazi to make a film in Japan. And the Japanese film minister, Masahiko Amakazu, wants to exploit this to create, in his words, a celluloid axis. But Nägeli has other plans in mind, and together with the German Jewish film critics Siegfried Krakauer and Lotte Eisner, who did really exist, he formulates a plan to fleece the Reich, as it were, spend inordinate amounts of their money making a film that will expose the whole charade. Needless to say, he does not succeed, as most do not in Kracht's novel, but the whole novel is also designed like a theater piece from the Japanese No theater. So there's a slow exposition, a quickening of the pace, and a very short denouement at the end. It's really a fascinating look, and it ends tragically on the Hollywood sign in Los Angeles. We are in the process of working on that translation, so hopefully it will be out in the next year or two.
Please email me,
I
keep
will.
me posted.
Thank you so much for coming.
Find out if there's any questions.
Yes, happy to answer any questions.
Well, if he has such good English, why would he do it himself?
I've asked him that question many times. And he answers, his answer is both true and untrue. He says, I could never translate my own work. But then he says that he is a writer, not a translator. There is a difference from rendering prose of others into one language as opposed to another. And in the debates around the translation of Imperium, I found that he tended to push more toward sort of polishing and rewriting the original in a way that, and it's his right and privilege as the author to do so. But I was more interested in, I was perhaps the sort of the seatbelt that kept him from lunging forward too much. He probably could have translated it into English, but I'm glad he didn't. Yes.
How long did it take you to do the translation?
The first draft took about 6 months. But because of the publication schedule, it meant that it had to go back and forth between the publisher and their readers to do proofreading, copy, line edits and the like, and some stylistic suggestions. And that took quite a bit longer, about 1.5 years to go back and forth. I've read the novel more than I care to admit at this point, but it hasn't bored me yet, so I'm still happy to look at it. But it took a long time. Yes?
I have several friends whose parents were German immigrants, and they grew up speaking at home with their parents, so they're obviously bilingual, extremely bilingual, because they grew up in the United States. But they all seem to take quite a bit of pride, I've noticed, in a subtle way, of the fact that later on they went to college and they learned to speak High German. The implication being that this language they were speaking was some sort of a dialect that wasn't as good as what do they call it?
Hochdeutsch.
Hochdeutsch.
Yes. It's actually a misleading term because Hochdeutsch is considered the standard language, and most Germans do speak a dialect and not the standard language. But Hochdeutsch, if we translate it as High German, it refers to a geographic region. So High German as opposed to Low German is German spoken in the highlands, and Low German is German spoken in the lowlands, in the north, in the plains. So unfortunately, in English we have the same kind of distinction between high and low as sort of a class distinction. That High German is a kind of elevated language, and Low German is not. It's not actually the case, but it can come across that way Speaking dialect in formal situations can be confusing, especially if you're speaking a dialect many people don't understand. The Bavarian dialect is hard for Northerners to understand. The Saxon dialect is routinely considered ugly throughout all of Germany. And Kracht's own, he speaks High German without an accent, but he can speak the Swiss version of German, which Germans themselves cannot understand, Schweizerdeutsch. It's a spoken language only, not a written one. But the dialectology of Germany is really fascinating. From village to village, it can change. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating.